Okay, so right now we're gonna get into another popular myth that you hear around the holidays, around Thanksgiving, Christmas, or from uneducated people. You hear people say that soul food is slave food, or they say that chitlins is slave food. They'll say that chitlins are the remaining parts of the pig that the slave masters didn't want, but gave it to the slaves, and they learned how to eat with the remaining carcass of the pig. No, that statement is completely false. Um, while in some instances, some slave masters did not eat chitlins and would give the rest to the slaves. In some small cases, yes, but mostly, no. Slave masters also ate chitlins, as chitlins is not something that was created by American slaves whatsoever. And if you even just take the time to do even a remotely even quick research, you'll see that chitlins is a Middle English word. Even in 1743, this was already in use. This is so easy to tackle and debunk. You have what they call chitlins now in other countries in the old world. They used to call entrails or hog trails. This is eaten by people all across the world in Europe, France, Spain, United Kingdom, where we mostly picked it up from. Chitlins were a common peasant food in medieval England and remained a staple of low diet income families right up until the late 19th century and not uncommon into the mid 20th century. During during the winter, they had the chance. During the winter, they had chance to weary of almost every form and kind of pig meat: hog puddings, gammons, chitlins, salted spare ribs, you name it. Uh, in England, they would call, or in the early colonial period, they would call it the winter slaughter. They would slaughter a bunch of pigs because in the wintertime, it was colder outside, so you could preserve the pig longer in the wintertime. So this is called the winter slaughter, which is around October, November, December, January, which is why it became a holiday tradition. Why we mostly eat this stuff like during the holiday season, which is during the cold time. This is something that was brought over from England and the upper in the upper part of England and Scotland. Here you see haggis made with sheep intestines, still a common traditional food in Scotland today. Now, where did most of the white Southerners come from? Scotland in the British Isles. They even eat this in Latin America. They eat it in Jamaica, Mexico. Culinary historian Adrian Miller. Now, he's the go-to guy when it comes to be an American food historian. I recommend his book, in which I'm going to get into later in this video. Points out that enslaved people did eat chitlins, but white people were eating them as well. In fact, if you look at slave narratives and oral histories of the era, there were quite a few references of making chitlins for the master, and eating intestines was something that was in white culture for centuries before we got to the American South. People that went on hunts would eat intestines as prize delicacies. People also say that chitlins was a slave food. No, chitlins was actually high end food by a lot of whites at a particular time in Europe. And that goes for most of all so called soul food, or what some people like to call slave food. There's nothing slave about it. Most of the foods in slave food were actually foods that were eaten by European elites. So it's pretty opposite of slave food actually. We're gonna get more into it. However, it is important to note that eating chitlins and other animals' intestines were not invented by slaves or even in America at all. American black slaves still held close to their West African heritage. and rituals, which included using intestines to be sacrificed to the gods. The Hausa actually eat the intestines of chickens. This highlights the fact that eating an animal's innards is a signature of West African diaspora, not just a imposition of white slave owners. Please also note that many slave masters requested chitlins as a dish to be prepared for them because eating an animal's intestines is quite popular in Britain and France. So conceptually, this dish is one that both slave and slave master were enjoying because it was a part of both their cultures before they were in America. Now, this is the book that we are about to source from. This guy is like the main go-to guy on of the American food historians, or especially black food historians in America. This is Adrian Miller, Soul Food, the surprising story of an American cuisine, one plate at a time. This tale begins with deer hunting. The English fell in love with eating innards several centuries ago, and much of it had to do with the aristocrat sport of chasing deer. For the British, the deer's internal organs were a high-end dish. As late as the 18th century, beef and pork intestines were a high-end food featured in British. Since pork meat was most consumed in the antebellum South, a hog killing was a momentous occasion on the plantation. In the antebellum days, the planters would kill as many as 70 to 100 head of hogs at a time, and then Negroes from neighboring plantations would come and help. Now they suddenly kill more than 15 or 20 at a time. The untold story of chitlins is not only that blacks and whites worked together to do the butchering that created chitlins, but also that both groups enjoyed chitlins, even though they ate them separately. In some big houses, master ate chitlins and were exacting as to how much they wanted their chitlins prepared. The FWP interviews with former slaves give further evidence that whites enjoyed chitlins. Chitlins had enough prestige in the big house that Willis Woodson of Texas remembers his mother auditioned for a cook's position by proving she could make chitlins. Quote, "Ma didn't work in the field." Now, here's where all of the leftover parts probably came from. Well, the myth about it. We killed a hog, the white folks got all the good part, at least they thought that. And we got the neck bones, the ears, the snoots, the tails, and the feet. And the entrails. What they call chitlins. The white folks didn't eat any of that stuff until the last years when hard times began to hit them. And they seen how we fared. Now you can't get to the counters to get them things for the whites. Nora's last sentence is telling, though whites supposedly shunned chitlins during slavery, Norris believed that was no longer the case when he was interviewed in the 1930s. As the hard times of the Great Depression came to an end, racial caste considerations about eating chitlins resurfaced. Chitlin eating among whites went private or entirely underground, while blacks continued to eat chitlins publicly. So you see, in the beginning, white people brought over this tradition and culture of eating chitlins, introduced it to the black slaves, and over time, the whites began to stop being public about eating it, or began to stop eating it so much, while the blacks kept it up, except for on certain considerations or holiday, like a annual chitlin holiday, like Chitlin Strut in Sally, South Carolina, where chitlins get a very public display of affection in this predominantly white town of 600 people. Now, given all the fuss, why on earth would anyone want chitlins? In Onji Fan Arisa, Food of the Gods, a study of Yoruba religious practices in New World foodways, Gary Edwards and John Mason challenged to consider that slaves may have wanted chitlins for spiritual reasons. In this book right here, you'll find this book to say that in the Yoruba tradition from West Africa, where a lot of slaves that came from, the tradition of sacrificing a chicken's innards or intestines to the gods was widely practiced. And sometimes they would eat the intestines themselves, but it was often given as sacrifice to the gods. So some of the slaves might have looked at eating innards or chitlins as eating the foods of the gods. A myth about eating chitlins is that chitlins were the only part of the pig that the master did not want, and that the slaves ate it because there was nothing else to eat. However, studies have shown that the slave masters not only gave slaves chitlins, but gave the slaves slabs of bacon and other parts of pig as well. In West Africa, although pigs' intestines were not eaten, the intestines of other animals were definitely eaten. The Hausa even eat the intestines of chicken. A small portion was traditionally given to the gods as an offering. By the beginning of the soul food era, whites had left chitlins behind as they moved up the economic ladder. Even in cookbooks aimed at poor whites, a chitlins recipe citing is less likely in current times. Ernest Mickler's Ernest excuse me. Ernest Mickler's White Trash Cooking 1986 and Janice Owens' Cracker Kitchen 2009 have no chitlins recipes. Even among all the funky dishes those odes to poor white cooking contain. On the other hand, Boiling and Baking in Booger Hollow 1971 and Cooking in Rebel County 1972 cookbooks authored by whites a few decades prior do. Over lunch at Atlanta's Busy Bees Cafe, and I ate there a few times, it is good, I discussed the matter of what poor whites and blacks ate with Jim Ochmoney, a former Atlanta Journal-Constitution food writer and a white Southerner. Ochmoney grew up in Atlanta and has extended family in northern Georgia. He told me, with Owen's book in mind, cracker food is soul food. And that's what I tell people so much. Soul food is a Black American spin on Southern cuisine. You see, Black Americans are already biological mixed with African, European, or British and Scottish to be exact, and Native American. So that's why our food, which is soul food, consists of European foods, African foods, and Native American foods mixed together with our own little spin and twist on it. I'll repeat this again. What this white man said. Cracker food is soul food. It is the same thing. It's just made a little differently. It's the same foods. Most of our foods come from European foods that we learned to cook when we came here. Cracker food is soul food. My people ate chitlins a couple generations back. I think a number of white Southerners can lay claim to the same heritage, but they have clearly moved on. Now we're going to get into some other soul food, fried chicken. Fried chicken is considered soul food, but however, we are not the first people to create or eat fried chicken. Fried chicken, the type of fried chicken that we eat in the South, comes from Britain. Fried chicken was in the British cookbook back in 1747 from Hannah Glasses. The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy. It was very popular in colonies in the 18th century. While it is difficult to assert a clear African provenance for American-style fried chicken, some evidence points to Britain. The earliest written recipe that looks like an American-style preparation appeared in 1747 in Hannah Glasses' The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy. This British cookbook was wildly popular in the American colonies during the 18th century, and American housewives who made the dish would have followed Glasses. Now, black-eyed peas, which is also part of soul food. Now, black-eyed peas comes from West Africa. Black eyed peas are native to West Africa. They were brought to the Americas by the Spanish to Florida and by the French to Louisiana. Black eyed peas are native to Africa. They have been popular food at least since the Middle Ages. Black eyed peas are believed to have first been domesticated near Africa's Lake Chad and was presently northeastern Nigeria and northern Cameroon. Now we're gonna get to mac and cheese, part of soul food. Mac and cheese also is our mix or version of European foods. Mac and cheese is an Italian food. For much of its early history, macaroni and cheese was a dish eaten by the European elite. That's right, this dish was so common in school cafeterias and middle class and lower class dinner tables across America was rich people's food. Let's get into fried catfish. Fried catfish, although catfish is in many different places, is mostly something that we was already eating in West Africa. Was Jefferson the first to serve macaroni and cheese in the United States? Probably not. Macaroni and cheese had already been an extravagant, trendy side dish on wealthy English tables well before Jefferson served it at his dinner parties in the United States. The Experienced English Housekeeper, 1769, and other British cookbooks that was popular in the American colonies had a macaroni and cheese recipe. All right, now we're gonna get into greens, part of soul food. We got turnip greens, collard greens, cabbage, all of that stuff. Now, as you can read from here, cooking greens with pork is an old school European cooking. Romans brought it to the British Isles. Green leaves are also very common in West Africa, although not too many of them cooked their greens with pork because there was a lot of Muslims societies there. Probably cooked it with other things. But specifically, turnips, collards, cabbage are the type of greens that West Europeans brought to West Africa and to the New World during the slave trade. Now, let's go ahead and get into cornbread, another important, very tasty part of soul food. Native Americans taught Europeans and enslaved Africans how to make bread using corn. So cornmeal, cornbread, hot water cornbread, all of that you name. This became part of the Black American soul food diet through Native Americans. Whether we were taught by Native Americans or some of us having Native American ancestors, this is where it comes from. Louisiana hot sauce are also a very important part of the Black soul food diet. Now, Louisiana hot sauce was created by a white man named Colonel Montel White in 1850. It was used as he used innovative hot sauce to end the health crisis among his slaves who shine light on who shine light on how a lot of them were using chili. So first off, chili peppers are native to the Americas. So this white guy, Colonel Manuel White in 1850, he shined a lot of light on it, how his slaves were utilizing the chilies, and he created it into sauce or hot sauce. And noticed it began to cure a lot of his sickly slaves. And so that's how it was marketed. That's the person who marketed it and was using it as a medicine. A lot of people back in the day would use hot sauce as a remedy or as a medicine. Now, let's get into that red Kool-Aid. Also, another very important part of the Black American soul food diet. Now, let's get into red Kool-Aid, another very important part of the Black American soul food diet that so many of us. You see, red Kool-Aid was invented by a white man named Edwin Perkins, who was a traveling salesman from Hastings, Nebraska in 1927. So let's just get that out the way. That's who created the red Kool-Aid. But what's also important to note is red drinks are very popular amongst us people or amongst people from West Africa. Red drinks were considered to be a very important part of like royal ceremonies and rituals. According to Newbill Puckett, a Southern folklorist and chronicler of African American folk beliefs in 1926. That's what he mentioned. He also mentioned that red is also a common color drink that people use in other cultures. Like in church, you use red wine for the blood of Jesus. This could have similarities with red just being the color of blood. In 1975, William Boseman says that red was a royal color at Ardra, which is a home of voodoo worship, which is why in Haiti, the favorite color of Haiti is red. Now, let's get into some good dessert, the candy yams. Now, how we make candy yams is basically from the fancy European recipes with carrots, not how Africans make their yams. Africans do not have, hold on. Africans do not have a high sugar diet at all. And even though, I'm sure most of y'all should know, even though we call a yam, the candy yams isn't actually a yam, it's sweet potatoes. And Europeans introduced sweet potatoes into West Africa. They introduced it from the Americas. The sweet potato comes from the Americas. So, yeah, the way that we cook candy yams is a European, specifically English and French recipe for how they used to cook certain types of carrots. Not how. Now, as far as other desserts like peach cobbler, the Spanish introduced peach trees to North America in the 1500s, but Native Americans were the ones who quickly began to use the peach trees more quickly and more efficiently. They planted and they also planted peach trees more. They're responsible for spreading the peach tree all over. They used it to make pies and other sweet dishes. So, the peach cobbler is which is part of the Black American soul food diet, is something that we picked up from the Native Americans. My personal favorite dessert, which is banana pudding. So banana pudding is mostly only it was mostly only a food that wealthy people had the luxury of eating. They would eat it on holidays or during special events. So all of this stuff about soul food being slave food is actually complete opposite. Most of this food that we got from Europeans were foods that were only eaten by European elites. And the British Caribbean cooks also experimented with putting bananas in their traditional desserts much earlier than the British North Americans. So it's also food that comes from the British. Sweet potato pie came to the Americas as an upper class English dessert around 1756. They used to call it yam pudding. Pound cake, another one of my favorites, which a lot of us like. Pound cake is basically oh, let me go to the source. So pound cake is basically this version of plum cake in Britain. It was a different version which was considered fruitless. So you see, most of our foods come from exactly the people who we are biologically mixed with and grew up with since our time here in America. Black Americans are already biologically about 75% African, 20% European, 5% Native American. So you'll notice that's why all of our foods are going to come from those three people. Our foods are going to come from mostly Europe, a few African foods, and Native American foods. Is what mostly consists of the Black American cultural food known as soul food. There's nothing slave about it. Most of the food was eaten by European elites. Chitlins was came from Europe. It's eaten in countries all around the world, and the slave masters also used to eat chitlins. So no, anybody who says this, we just easily debunk it with this. Everybody have a happy Thanksgiving and holidays.